Yeah, we just keep watching the mountains this afternoon going, hope we can get home this afternoon. It's just snowing over there. I may have to leave my little car behind. Oh, well, let's get started. Let me pray for us. Father, we come before you again, Lord, just wanting to put ourselves in your hands. We put our church in your hands. We put our leadership in your hands. God, we just want to be obedient to you. Help us to understand your will. Help us to be the church that you have called us to be. In Jesus' name, amen. All right. Well, I'm going to have another, I've been showing these really crazy little clips just because it's fun. But think about how this clip relates to the church. It's really appropriate. Wouldn't that be the worst? Anybody ever done that? Don't tell us. How discouraging is that? So kind of pop off here. Tell me, how does this parallel what it's like sometimes working in the church? Using the wrong tools? Ill-equipped, yes.
Putting a lot of effort in the wrong place.
A lot of effort in the wrong place. That's good.
You didn't analyze the situation before you started.
No, yeah, he obviously didn't pay enough attention up front. He was eager, though. How much help did he have?
He blessed somebody else.
Yeah, he did bless somebody else. Yeah, unintentionally, but yeah, somebody else walked outside and they're pretty happy. That's a good perspective.
It never gets that bad of weather here.
Yeah. So, are we working in vain? Depends on what we're trying to accomplish. Is it possible to go through a whole week and have been working in vain? It is. It's possible to work really, really hard and be doing it in vain. It's possible to work really, really hard by yourself with the greatest intentions, and it'd be in vain. Because if we don't know what we're trying to accomplish, we could be scraping the wrong car. Are we as a church using our volunteers, our resources to do the right things? We have limited. Every church has a limited amount of workers. Even if we had 100% of us doing it, we still have there's a limited supply. And so, how are we using that? How are we using our energy? Are we doing the things that matter the most? Are we, putting the effort where the effort needs to be placed? Or do we find ourselves doing something in vain? And we have to be so careful. Here, COVID, one thing that's been, almost every pastor I talk to, one thing that we all have in common, even those whose attendance really hasn't dropped through COVID, one thing we all have in common is the number of volunteers has shrunk it's crazy. I mean, I know one pastor, his church actually grew through COVID, and they still have less volunteers. For whatever reason. So if we have fewer volunteers, can we afford to waste our time on doing something that doesn't matter? I don't think we can. So we have to always be thinking, are we doing what we're supposed to be doing? And so as we continue this process over the next several weeks, one of the reasons that we need to know what our goals are, what our vision is to know whether or not we're spending the time in the right places. Are we doing what we are supposed to be doing? So, we're going to look at something that has been around for a very long time. And if you have trouble reading those up there, use your magnifying app. And Judy will tell you how to find it if you need to know. The magnifying app, and you can look at the small words on my page. But this is, I think it's interesting that this graph, I can remember using the same exact graph in the early 90s when I was helping do lay renewals. Does anybody remember, did y'all do those around here? It was a big thing. Oklahoma still has teams that go and do that some. But, you'd have a group of just lay people come from different churches and all come and help a church go through a weekend of prayer and just kind of a revival type of thing. But anyway, I can remember using this same exact chart. Back then, I was recommended a book by a director. He's now director of missions. He's a longtime pastor in Oklahoma. He's now in one of the western Oklahoma places, and he actually speaks on the revitalization circuit. Is that kind of what it is? I don't know what they are, but anyway. But when they do the conferences, he's one of the guys who usually gets called to come in and teach, and he's really been up on his stuff. And I was visiting with him a year ago, maybe even longer than that ago, when I was kind of sitting around the office, kind of trying to figure out what to do because I couldn't do anything. One sermon a week. So I'm kind of sitting bored. I call him one day, and we're talking revitalization stuff. And he goes, "You need to read this book. It's by Dell. What's his first name? Anyway, last name's Dell. He wrote 40 years ago." You probably have read some of his books because he almost every church growth book in the world back in 40 years ago, he's the one that wrote them. And he goes, "You need to read this book." And I'm like, "Yes, you're okay. We're sitting here talking about all this stuff, and you give me a 40-year-old book." Well, that book is where this graph actually showed up at the first time. And actually, almost every chapter, anything that you see in all the new books is an adaptation of his book 40 years ago. It's kind of interesting. So anyway, so this has been around for a long time, but I think it obviously serves a really good purpose because it's still around. It's still being used and talked about in academic circles all the time. And that's the life cycle of a church. And this seems to hold true almost universally. And it's interesting. There's a sociological aspect to how this works. It's a lot of businesses can find themselves on this same cycle as well. So if we look up here, we have the birth of the church. And when was this church birthed? 68. And it was a dream that came from First Baptist Church, and to put a church in a specific area in town where there was needed. So notice that the birth is right there, but there's things that happen down here, right? Can y'all see my little pointer thing? But there's things that happen down here, like somebody had to dream the idea. Someone began to see the need and all that stuff. But then it began with the birth, and then there's this growth. There's this growth that happens. And it's interesting as you look at a lot of the churches that were planted back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that from here to here usually happened in about 10 to 15 years. You almost could tell what size the church was going to be by seeing where they were about 10 to 15 years after they started. But you have the birth, you have the growth, and then you have the maturity of the church, and then you start to go into maintenance mode and decline, and then death. But notice there's this line that keeps going under death. Most churches die a long time before they shut the doors the last time, but there becomes a point where it is over. And so, where on this graph does the church start declining? Right there at the very, very top. When are things going the greatest? Right up there at the very, very top. Isn't it interesting that one day things are going as good as they've ever been, and the next day you're going down decline, but how long does it usually take to notice that's happening? Years and years and years is pretty normal. If we were to put really a real timeline with this, you could look at, from here to here about 15 years, and then you could have decades right here. When you're kind of on that maturity to maintenance mode, before the church starts to really have the decline and death. Sometimes it happens faster, a lot of different things that can happen and go to that, but that is kind of the natural tendency. And so don't get depressed yet. We're going to bring hope out of this in a second. So, crisis. In every situation that's going on, there is a crisis that happens. Okay? Because when you birth the church, everything's exciting. People start showing up, and all of a sudden, if you're meeting in a school or you're meeting in a smaller building or whatever, eventually you start kind of outgrowing it, or you start needing more leadership. Everybody's new. Somebody say So if everything's new, if everybody's new, who do you trust with money? You ever thought about that one? So, there's a lot of issues. And so the crisis becomes structure, right? There's a structural, how are we going to organize? How are we going to continue to do ministry? And then you have this crisis of leadership. Who's going to be who we're looking to for leaders? And then there's a crisis as we get into the maintenance mode of control. You see the difference between leadership and control? Who's in control is not always the leader, but they make all the decisions. But in leadership, people are trying to see who they're going to follow. When it starts becoming about control, all of a sudden there's fighting involved, right? Who's making this decision? Why am I not making this decision? And so then it begins, as you have fights over control, it comes into polarization, okay? And so on the other side, on the outside thing here, birth comes out of a dream. You have to learn to begin to clarify what's going on, which adds to our structure. And then you expand as a church, you add more stuff, you start building on the outside of your facility. Go to any Baptist church, just about any denomination church, and you're going to see a similar thing that we have here. What did we build here first? This room. Then what did we need to add? We had to add some stuff on the back, and then we needed to add some things on the side, and then we needed to go 2 stories, and then we needed to put some office space in, because you're building this structure, and you have to expand in order to continue doing ministry. You have to organize it. And then, all of a sudden, you go from the organization, and what I like to think right through here is a whole lot of bureaucracy that drives us to a place of nostalgia. So, when you're organizing and expanding, you're usually looking to the future and how things can get better. When you start the nostalgia, what are you thinking of? The past, how good it used to be. Remember back when we filled this worship center up? Do you remember back when we had a full choir loft of singers? You remember? It becomes nostalgia. And a lot of the reasons people will still attend a church in this situation is because when they walk in, they have all the memories of the past. It's not, I'm coming here because I'm excited about what God's going to do in the future. I'm coming here because it makes me feel good of all the things that we used to do. I remember back. And it's still a positive feeling, but it's rooted in something that's not where God wants us to be, in this nostalgia. And then, as there's this control and crisis, and you're trying to maintain, and as long as a church is just trying to maintain, you're going to fail. Okay? There's no way to just this is as big as we need to get, we're going to keep it here. We were having one of these discussions at Eastern Heights, and I had a lady in the church that, we're talking about the church growing and how we do this and how do we do that if things were bigger. And she raised her hand. She goes, Pastor, but the reason I'm here is because I like the size of this church. The reality is if this happens, I'm going to go somewhere else. I was like, well, at least somebody in the room was honest, but oh my goodness, But, that she liked it there, but you're living in this nostalgia, you're living in this comfort zone, this maintenance, but eventually you can't keep the momentum when you're doing that. You're not going to get new people when you're acting like that, and then it leads to this questioning. Why? What's happening? Must be the preacher's fault, or it must be the deacon's fault, or it's always the preacher's fault. And then we begin to just question everything, and then it becomes a blaming. And usually the blaming and nostalgia kind of go together because, you remember back 20 years ago when so-and-so did this, that's the reason that we're in this place. Or it's blaming. It's never an admittance that there's anything going on here. It's a blame. It's other people's fault. And then there is the leaving, which goes right down to death. And like I said, there becomes a place. There's a church in the state was talking about with one of the state guys the other day, and they're doing a restart. But I worry about a restart when you have the same exact leadership that was still left when the church died. And it's not that those are bad people, but the personality and the outlook of someone who's willing to stick around even to the point of death, they're loyal people. But they really are they the people that you want to begin to work with to start new? I'm not sure how that's playing a part, and I'm interested for someone to change my mind on that in some of our church planning strategies that's going on in our world right now, because I struggle with that one. Let's use that facility, but I think we need to tell all those people to go find somewhere else to go, and that's just mean. We don't do that. So anyway, but there's a lot of churches that are here. I've tried to help a lot of churches that are here. The problem a lot of times once the church gets down here is they're so protective of what they have, they can't think about taking any kind of risk. Because every little risk means we're going to have to close the doors for the last time. We can't invest and begin to, try to do some outreach, because what if they tear up the building? We can't afford to fix it. We've heard that excuse. And I'm going, oh my goodness. When you get there, how in the world do you get out of it? There was a church in Bartlesville, a church that in the 90s was running 400. They were down to about 15. And I'm visiting with them, and we wanted to partner with them as our church and begin to try to help them. They were in a part of town that was very unreached, and we just had this great idea. And we went, I'm over there. We did this block party with them, and we did it. Used their lot next door, and some of their church membership came and helped, but it was mostly our people. And at the end of the event, one of the guys said, "Man, I sure hope none of these people show up tomorrow. We don't have a class for them." Like, we just wasted our time. Because they couldn't see. They couldn't see out of this. This is where we are. We're trying to stay open. We just want to keep the doors open. And we messed up on understanding what the church is when we get to that point. So, but death is real. There are thousands of churches in the United States, thousands of Southern Baptist churches in the United States that close their doors for the last time every year. Now we've been where we were starting more churches than we were losing, but that hasn't been the case the last few years. COVID definitely, a lot of the church starts have really struggled, as you can imagine. But churches die. It's the reality. We're going to talk about some hope, because Well, how many churches of the 7 churches of Revelation are still existing today? 0. Okay? So, there's something natural about this, but it's not about just trying to make sure we stay alive, but it is making sure we stay healthy. And so that's what we're going to talk about in just a second, but I want you to break up into some small groups, 4 or 5 people or so. I want you to discuss, where are we on this chart and why? Kind of answer the question, think about why you think that we are on that. Be honest, think kind of truthfully where we are, and we'll kind of throw your answers out here in a little bit. So break up just a second, just about 7 or 8 minutes at the most, just talk about this. I'm sorry to interrupt. There's one thing that I did not point out on this that I really should say, is that this is not necessarily attendance. It most of the time will reveal itself in attendance, but it's not necessarily attendance. It's more of health and overall structural health. So anyway, but for most churches, and I think in our case, attendance is probably a good indicator of that, but it's not always. But anyway, go ahead. All right, kind of finish up your discussion. So who wants to help answer that question? Where are we on the chart? Judy? Okay. 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 Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Good. Mike?
Our group kind of looked at, many of us, because we had the same thing, we had a mixed group.
Yeah.
Folks that have been here for a long time, and those that have not. It's kind of funny. One person says, "I'm so new." And I'm like, "You've been here for 4 years." That's kind of how it is, you know?
Yeah.
Because honestly, there's some tentpole parts of our history as a church that I've been here for 10 years and I've never been a part of. But I said personally that I thought it was more between between the nostalgia and the questioning parts. But then we also had folks that said it was probably more towards the maintenance phase, that it was up there. There may be a little nostalgia, but there's enough new people that they don't have the nostalgia because they weren't here for it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's a good point. Yes. Okay. So more closer down in here. She said that her group, they kind of all been around for a while, and they kind of see the church more here, down between maintenance and decline. What did I say? Oh, they've been around for a while. I wasn't going to call them old. Do what? Mature, yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. If you're not hearing her, she's saying that, we're having a hard time just getting people to go back to work right now in our culture, much less volunteers and doing things like that. That's a good point. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We point the laser at them. Yeah. So, but I will say, look who's joined over the last month, and we've had some young couples, which has been really awesome. But yes, I was just pointed at you with the laser.
The young folks over here.
They haven't been around very long.
We also agreed that we think our church is between like the maintenance and decline section. And as we discussed this, we kind of noticed within our church, there's been a lack of like leadership, and I'm not talking about staff. I'm talking about like strong pillars of our church. A lot of them have died. A lot of them are older to where they can't serve in the capacity that they used to. And us young folk are not stepping up.
Yeah, so she made a really good point. So when we have lost a lot of leadership, if we aren't constantly replacing the leadership, you have to go to maintenance mode. There's no other choice. There's nowhere else to go. You just got to stick people in a place where they'll just get the job done. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. Where's Lewis? He made all the phone calls for getting people to serve in committees. We had some talks about that. It's like, why is everybody telling me no? Why won't anybody call me back? That's really most of us. Like, that's the church calling. Don't answer that one. So, but very good point. Yes. Mm-hmm.
The way that our culture is tending, if people are too lazy to go to work, how do we get them in church?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a big question.
It's almost like this laziness that's inbred our culture all of a sudden. Out of nowhere, we kind of like staying home and only being at church for an hour a week. Mm-hmm. And there's a big trend of that, and it's one of those things. I think we could have a discussion a long time about the positives and negatives of not having a facility, and there's both. If we were in Southern California, it's like get rid of it completely. But after a year being outside, I don't know. But anyway, but there's some positive, and they're definitely a group that their expectation of what church is different than what the generations before them, when we think of what's the expectation of church. A worship center was an expectation. If they didn't have a building, it's not a church. So we started in 1968, isn't that what somebody said? 58, 1958. There's two things that happened on the same exact day. I'm almost positive it happened here, if I remember reading it, but almost every church started in the 50s, 60s, 70s, probably even into the 80s. There's two things that happened on the same exact day. You dedicated a building, and you officially became a church. Right? You ever thought about that? It's like, what did they do? The very first thing they did, they built the building. And those things happen. I know Eastern Heights, they met for 2 years as a mission of First Baptist Church, and then the day that they dedicated their building was the day they also got incorporated as a church. And that was pretty common. I would assume it's probably very similar here. So, isn't that interesting? You couldn't think about being a church unless you had a building. Those things went together. Nowadays, the first time there's 5 people that meet in a house in a small group, we're saying, okay, we're starting that church. This is a church. And then that has positive and negatives too, because something about being a mission and having that support is good too. So there's something that sometimes gets missed. They kind of get on their own, but that's a whole nother story. So yes, Mike.
My dad's church, they got started in a bar. That's where they met.
They weren't a good Baptist church, obviously. Huh? Huh?
I think Elephant Butte Baptist Church, I know one of the churches down in TRC, the same thing. They got started in a bar.
That's good. So, any of the other groups? What do y'all? You think see anything different?
I think it depends on what year did we come into the church.
Uh-huh.
It would have a lot to do because there was probably already declining or there was already something going on, and I just think it depends on like what year did we get established to the church.
Mm-hmm. And that's what you saw that in your conversations, right? We all have a different perspective of the church. So those of you that are new, and I kind of cracked up when you said that somebody's been here 4 years and they still see themselves as new, because there's a time at Eastern Heights 4 years would have put you in the top 80%. Where was I going to say?
When you come,
Well, your personal experience. What do you bring with you? So if you came from a dysfunctional place and you come here and you perceive something that's functioning well, you're going to perceive the health of the church differently. If you bringing that in. If you just joined, the reason you joined is because you had a positive view of the church. You didn't come here because, that church is dead. No. If you did, there's maybe a different issue. But so you are bringing those things. And so, those that have been around for a long time probably have a better feel of actually where we are as far as this goes. Because, there's churches that when they start, their cycle thing may be more like this. They never got really healthy. And there's some that maybe it's a mountain that goes way up. It's healthier. And so it's, if you're coming in from the outside, you're only going to evaluate what you see going on by experience, what you've known by other churches and your relationship there. So, go ahead, Mike. That's the next thing we're talking about, for sure. If you haven't been around to experience the past, you really don't know. And I'll say this, we're healthy. In a lot of ways, we are healthy. But we have some signs of some problems. One of the reasons I'm taking the risk in doing this process, because, like this morning, it's been easy just to sit back and relax. There's risk involved when you start leading out and talking about the C word. But the reason, we are healthy in a lot of ways, but we have some signs that are scary. And y'all pointed it out, the age of the people in our congregation. We have a $900,000 budget. We'll talk about in business meeting a little bit about how real that really is. But we have a $900,000 budget. 90% of our giving comes from those 70 and over. Where are we in 10 years? Where can we be in 10 years if things don't change? All right? it's... people were asking me what kind of church I was going to, and I was like, man, they're great people. I see some signs of great things. I love the committee. Great. Our location and our facilities are top notch. It doesn't get any better anywhere than, our location, and our facilities are about as good as anybody's. All right. Maybe some of those churches that ran 3,000 have some things, but they're bouncing around in a big, giant, empty building, right? I think we have some great advantages to where we are, to what we have, and great things. But I said this to somebody, and I used the same phrase this morning in my sermon, and very personal, but I'll just bring it out here. there's a greater chance of failure than success. It's kind of how I felt, because it is hard to move from here and to go to the next things we're going to talk about. It's hard. Ed Stetzer and Geiger, I think they're the two that wrote that book. I know Geiger was part of it, Eric Geiger. They did the breakout churches. It was a take on Good to Great for you business people that read Good to Great. And Good to Great was taking, looking for businesses that had been good for a long time that did what was necessary to become great. And so they took that same idea and let's find some churches that have been good that become great. And the reality was, he said there's one thing that he tried to look for that he kind of took out of the equation, and that is it took a pastor change in order to get there. So we wanted to take that out of the equation because he didn't want everybody just thinking they need to go have a pastor change. And the reality was, I think he found like 10 churches. He had a hard time. It's not that they're the only ones, but when you're looking through the stats and you're trying to figure this out, he had a hard time. One of the things he said in his book, he had a hard time identifying them. It is hard. It is hard to change. It's hard to re-establish a new path. But is it worth it? I think it is. Does everybody in this room have the chance to lose something in the process? We do. But we can't let that right there keep us from doing this over here. Okay? We can't just become nostalgic. And because that's when you begin to say, well, you can change anything, preacher, but I'm not moving out of my classroom. We've been here for 30 years. Or, pastor, you can do this, but we can't, we're not going to change that. That's the nostalgia. Do what?
We get so comfortable.
We get comfortable. Yeah, nobody likes change, and Christians seem to hate change for some reason. Okay, Mike?
I heard it said one time, what are the sacred cows in the church?
Sacred cow. Yeah, and we all have them. And the crazy thing is, if we did everybody would have their own. Sometimes there's like some that are like universal, but most of the time we all kind of have our different little things of what's important, what we think just cannot be touched. It'd be like taking the cross out of church if we did that. Yeah, changing the carpet color. Yeah. We're nice neutral browns around here with blue chairs. That was a pretty good touch. We woke up, we had pink walls, so beat that. So, here's my perspective coming in, all right? And I'm trying to look at it, the research that I have done and just my experience in this whole process is, I think that group back there and this group right here probably have it pretty close, and I think that we're like right here. Oh, right there at closer to decline than maintenance. And it's, I don't know, what's up? I don't know, what's the matter with this thing? It's not. If I shooting at an airplane, I'd go to jail just for that, though, wouldn't I? So, anyway, and the reason I say that is we're healthy. And there's a lot of churches, I think that if you look at theirs, they never get to that point. But if you look at where the church has been over the last 20 years, and you look at attendance, and you look at giving, you look at the number of volunteers, and you look at the average age, because I think those things all matter. I think that, I don't want to look at COVID numbers, but even before the last pastor left, the church was already down numerically from the 10 years before that. And it's happening slow. And, went through decline from 1959 all the way to 2004, where they just lost on average about 7 people a year. Doesn't feel too bad when you're running 600. When you start running 100, all of a sudden you start noticing. But, Wewoka was here. It was closer to death than it was to maintenance, for sure. So it's not bad, but we need to face the reality that the trajectory of our church is becoming less healthy, not more healthy. Okay? So let me take us to this next slide. Here's what won't happen. I couldn't make it draw what I wanted to draw, so I did it myself. Isn't that pretty? So you don't just go from decline and then act like there is no, you can't just go from here and pretend like none of this happened and then come back over here and start over. All right? There's churches that will come over here to the death, and that was the church I was talking about that, they're trying to take some of those same people and move it over here. They'll try that, but we're not going to just go from wherever we are to right over here. This is really a better picture of what it is that churches have to do. All right? And where this right here happens, I stuck it down that low just because it fit in my picture better, all right? But where that happens can be different with every church. It's different where we figure out that, it's time to rebirth, redream, rethink, reinvestigate why God has us here. We're not putting aside all the stuff that happened over here. We're not at the place that we need to change our name and put and try to do something to the front of the church so people don't even recognize it when they drive by. I know churches that really need to do that. Their reputation so bad that really the best thing they can do in the community is pretend like they never existed and have a whole new identity. But we don't need to do that, and we are who all this is. This is our past. And what we're going to do in that first summit is going to have a lot to do with looking at our past and understanding who we are, who we've been. Until we can't know who we are. Those of you that are new, the reason you can't really figure out, you have a struggle trying to figure out where we are on this is because we don't all know the history, don't know the good things and the bad things that have happened, that the baggage we carry with us. And some of it's good baggage and some of it's bad baggage. But we don't know all those things. And so we're going to be discussing that. That's the main part of our first summit is going to be trying to understand that past, okay? And so, but we have to come to a realization that we need to be reborn. That we need to find a way to start over. So we can begin to dream again. I don't have all those things up here, but begin to dream again, begin to restructure, and begin to think about moving forward. We're not going to. I am not destroying the whole history of the church. We can't. There's no way to take it out of us. We don't have one of those lasers like they have in what is that superhero cartoon where they put the suction cup, or Incredibles, put the suction cup on and make them just lose all their memories, right? It's not what we're trying to do. It's not important. Matter of fact, we lose so much wisdom. And so, but at the same time, if we just want to, we can't back up. The church can't back up in the process and go, okay, let's just get back here to the maturity place and all is good. We're already here. And the only way to get out of it is to continue, is to be reborn. And then we got to find a place to be reborn. A church continually has to redream, continually trying to figure out what it is that God wants us to do. It's a new generation, a new time, new people we're trying to reach. There are some good things happening at Del Norte. As I said, we've had 2 couples in their 20s that have walked forward on a Sunday morning to join the church. You know how often that happens? Never. Okay, these are solid people, and we got some solid folks over here, and they're having friends. Y'all have friends? Yeah, they have friends, and there's some great things here, and there is a foundation, let me tell you, of our future that when we're looking for new leadership, we need to be pouring. If they're not ready to be leaders, we better be trying to make them leaders. All right? Because this is the future. And it's not the future to keep things just like they are. They're the future to help us make sure that we're being relevant in the world in which we live. They're going to have a perspective that the rest of us don't have. And, it is so cool to have, especially that some of y'all grew up in the church. That's so awesome. Every church I've been in, everybody left to go to college, and we never saw them again. There's no jobs to come back to, so why would they come back? And so it's awesome. I mean, we have some good things. But we have some things we got to figure out. And we're not going to get to everything I wanted to get to tonight, but we got to get out of debt. You'll see numbers in our business meeting here in just a couple minutes where we're like over $100,000 for meeting budget for 2021. We pay $108,000 a year to debt. What fixes our budget? Getting rid of $100,000 worth of staff? Ouch. We don't. Just cutting us all? You're the closest. Roy's salary doesn't get us very far, Kevin. I don't know. But you see what you see? There's things that we're going to carry some weight with us, but we got to get rid of some of the weight as we redream, and priorities have to be different, and our whole purpose has to be different. And awesome thing is, we've paid off about 30% of our debt over the last 14, 15 months, something like that. That's awesome. Really, we do that for 2.5 more years, it's done. All right, but we can't just sit back and wait for it to be over too. So we got some work to do. But just know that the farther down you go, the more desperate the prospect of getting out of it is. And we are not in a place that we're not salvageable. But we have a choice as a church. Del Norte Baptist Church is going to be here for another 20 years, even if it's dead. The facilities are too good. We take 20 years onto this building. We don't put another dime into it. We may get hot in the summer and cold in the winter, but those only last for a couple weeks each time. And so, it's not too bad. It doesn't get hot before noon. We'll figure out how to open some windows. We have people that help us open the windows. We can make it 20. But the question is, do we want to be healthy? Do we want to make an impact? Do we want Albuquerque to be different because we're sitting here? And I think we do. It's worth it. It's what God wants us to do. I will catch us up on this at some point. We are not meeting next week. But then we will be back at it after that. And so, we'll look at this revitalization paradigm that's on there next time, and we'll catch up with it. This other one I think was the most important anyway, and kind of thought we might get stuck on it, and because it helps us evaluate where we are, who we are, and what risk we need to take as we rebirth. We're not at that place, like I said, we're completely dying, completely starting over from scratch. But we need to go from where we are and put some rebirth, some new energy, a catalyst for future growth as we move forward. And I'm excited about it. I hope tonight's not discouraging. I don't want it to be discouraging. I want it to, it's, what I say this morning, be a realist. No. We're looking to the future. We need to understand where we are so we can dream and go to the future. And it's going to be good. We have to see, as Nehemiah did this morning, we have to see the brokenness. We can't ignore it. We can't think that it's a good thing. We need to call it for what it is. But then we look to the future. No, this is where he's calling us. And he's taking us somewhere different. And we're going to be ready to respond. So it's good. Yes, Mike?
I would highly put out there, though, that when you look at the bad, that it does become a blame.
It didn't become what?
Doesn't it become a blame game?
Yes. We do. We cannot be blaming. It's not about that. The reality is there's a lot of people that have added to the history of this church. And you can't say it was just one person. You can't say it was just that one preacher, or that it's a combination of a lot of things. And the reality is probably everybody that's ever had an impact in this church has had a positive and negative. And so it is our past. And we're not going to blame. We're looking to the future. But we want to be honest. And when we get to that first summit, we're going to have to be honest about positive and negative. We don't want to just pretend some things didn't happen. But that's not who we are. It's not who we're going to be. He's taking us somewhere. God's the one who holds our identity, and we want our identity in Him. And so I'm excited about where that goes forward. And if you're someone who cares, Robert Dell's the guy who wrote the book. I remembered his name a while ago. That was pretty good. So Robert Dell. If you need last or any of the previous weeks, we have some extra copies up here if you would like to have that. If you're having problems getting online and watching any of the back ones, if you've missed those, let me know. We'll figure out what we can do to fix you up on that. So, Roy, close us in prayer, please.